day in the country, and you'll have lunch, and maybe there'll be an oompa band. And of course, they were in fact exterminated. Now, when World War II started, and by the way, Adolf Hitler, it is important to remember, was chosen and supported and trained by a committee of American industrialists, including John D. Rockefeller Jr., Henry Ford, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Averell Harriman's forebearers, the Bush uncles, George W. Bush's uncles. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. sent his own personal public relations man, John Ivy, to Europe prior to Hitler's coming out party, so to speak. And he conducted a little finishing school for three guys you may have heard of, Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels, on precisely how to run propaganda operations and take over large numbers of people's minds and behaviors. So this was all well coordinated. This was intended to be what we're living with now. But oops, things didn't go quite as anticipated. The League of Nations didn't do what it was supposed to do. And so World War II brought about a little pause in the globalist control, the globalist hegemony. But not to worry, we reformat the League of Nations into the United Nations, and we create new organizations like Codex Alimentarius, the World the World Health Organization. Yes.
I call them the World Hell Organization, but I think the World Holocaust Organization is very fitting.
I think that works along with the Fraud and Death Administration of the United States and our Center for Disease Creation. Mm-hmm. So the World War II did not go as it was intended in some quarters, and the heads of IG Farben, the civilian side of the German war machine, the industrial side, the heads of IG Farben were sent to jail after the war concluded. They were basically all the pharmaceutical executives of Germany and of Austria and of the other parts of the German Empire. Now, interestingly, it just so happens that John D. Rockefeller Jr. owned controlling interests in all of those companies. Isn't that interesting? And John D. Rockefeller Jr., as we know, is responsible for the near destruction of natural medicine in the first world and the creation of pharmaceutical medicine, so-called conventional medicine. There's nothing conventional about poisoning enzyme systems, to say the least. Anyway, the heads of the pharmaceutical industry were plucked out of that set of jobs and put into their leadership positions in IG Farben. After the war didn't go as predicted and Germany, quote, lost the war, whatever that turns out to mean, several things happened. One was that these guys went to jail. They went to jail for 4 years, 4.5 years, and they weren't treated too shabbily while they were in jail. And then they got out of jail and they got new suits and new haircuts and new shoes, and they went back to work as the senior executives, the president and CEOs and so on, of the same pharmaceutical companies who had, during the war, been making things like Zyklon B, but never mind. And then they went back into the pharmaceutical business of making people allegedly healthy. Okay. And they were not happy because Germany had lost the war. So they got together and they said, well, that didn't work. What else can we do to take over the world? And they thought about it, and these were smart dudes, including the celebrated Fritz Termeer, head of Bayer Pharmaceutical. And they said, wait, food. we could take over the world's food, presaging by a number of years what Henry Kissinger said, which is he who controls the world's food supply controls the world.
Yes.
And Kissinger, of course, was a disciple of this particular school of evil, and still is. Anyway, they got together and they had a meeting, and they wrote a letter. They wrote a letter to the fledgling United Nations. This was in 1952. And all of them signed the letter. And they said, you know what? We think that you, United Nations, ought to take over the world's food supply. Why don't you, globalist organization, take over the world's food supply? And the United Nations said, that's a cool idea. Yeah, we should take over the world's food supply. But they didn't have the power to put any force behind that. So they had some very weak voluntary regulations in this thing called Codex Alimentarius, the food code. Now, there had been a Codex Alimentarius in Austria, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, way back into the 19th century, when the courts had to have some rules to decide what was adulterated food, what was unadulterated food, how much was a fair measure, and so on. Governments do that sort of thing. In fact, in medieval England, there was a Department of Weights and Measures, and they went around measuring butchers' scales to make sure they were weighing properly, and checking bread to make sure that it didn't have talcum powder in it and only had flour and water.
Yes, if it's for the right reasons, that's all well and good, but that's right. Not what this was. I actually didn't know this went back all the way back to 1952. The earliest Codex Alimentarius documents that I could find, I think, was 1974.
Well, what happened was it took a while. I mean, the wheels